Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Bruce Stanger, and I'm the program chair for Community Conversations on Racial Inequity. This is a year-long series designed to shine a light on racism in America and the Jewish community's role in creating a more racially just society. Community Conversations is presented by the Jewish Community Relations Council and the Jewish Leadership Academy, both of which are part of the Jewish Federation of Greater Hartford. We are very grateful to them and to Liberty Bank for its financial support of the series. A special thank you to all on staff and the committees that have helped make this happen. Many volunteers made a difference. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to remind you about the reading program that accompanies Community Conversations. We are leading a community-wide reading and discussion of Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns, about the American Black community's great migration from the rural South to the cities of the North and West, including Hartford. We'll be holding a community discussion of the book in August. If you'd like to join the reading program, please reach out to me, Alana Butler, or Jody Engel after the program. We will be announcing our second book toward the end of the summer or beginning of the fall. It has been especially gratifying when we learn of institutions that are having their whole institution, such as one synagogue that is having their book group read the book together, and then will be joining us at the program. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator and panelists. Our moderator, Elysa Graber-Lipperman, is a member of the Community Conversations Program Committee and is also the incoming chair of the Jewish Leadership Academy's Advisory Board. Elysa is a graduate of the Wexner Institute program, which meant so much to Linda and to me, and a longtime community volunteer. She also has a successful law practice in West Hartford. Our panelists, Tyron V, Alex Putterman, and Omarys Vasquez, have a wide range of experience with the issues we will be discussing tonight. Tyron Harris is the head of human resources for the Wadsworth Atheneum Museum of Art and a member of East Hartford Board of Education, a position to which he has been elected 3 times. Tyron holds a BBA in management with a concentration in human resources from the Berkeley College of New York, an advanced certificate in strategic human resources from Cornell University. Alex Putterman is a reporter for the Hartford Courant and the author of an in-depth article on racial segregation in West Hartford and Bloomfield. He has also written extensively about COVID-19 and other issues impacting our state. Alex's writing has also appeared in The Atlantic, Vice, and SI.com. He grew up in West Hartford and currently lives in East Hartford. Omarys Vasquez is an associate at the architecture firm, hope I get this right, Vasquez and Partners. Born of migrant parents seeking the American dream, she lived in New York City public housing for much of her young life. Omarys is a member of the American Institute of Architects and serves on its Connecticut Women in Architecture Committee. She co-founded the first Connecticut chapter of the National Organization of Minority Architects and is accredited in LEED, Green Building Practices. Please join me in welcoming Elysa, Tyron, Alex, and Omarys. Glad you're here.
Thank you, Bruce. It is truly an honor to be part of tonight's conversation. And on behalf of everyone tuning in, I want to express our sincere gratitude to our panelists for joining us this evening. So let's jump right in. So starting with Omarys, then Tyron, then Alex, I'm going to ask you each to start us off by speaking about your experience and unique perspective on racial segregation in Connecticut. Omarys, please expand on your remarks when you begin by discussing the relationship between housing and racial segregation.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm really excited. This is an important topic, as we all know, and I'm happy to share my story and my experiences. So as they have introduced, I am an architect. I have 15 years of experience and originally from New York City. I grew up most of my life in public housing. So racial segregation in housing is really close to my heart. And it's something that we are hoping, as part of NOMA CT, as architects, as people, community members, that we can help to dispel some of the myths and the uncertainties around, excuse me, I'm so sorry. Phone's on vibrate. Kind of dispel all of those kinds of and demystify all the uncertainties around multifamily housing and kind of racial segregation for housing. And me personally, growing up in public housing, underprivileged, my parents, of course, as they mentioned, were immigrants and did not have a lot to their name. So they strived to push us to get an education and to learn and get a career, but being zoned in an area with a lot of other minorities and lower income people, your resources are extremely limited. And I think that's the most important part about housing segregation, is that when you are corralled, I guess, if for lack of a better term, in a certain area, there are not a lot of resources, there's not a lot of funding, say, in the schools in those areas. And therefore, you're not providing that community with the same quality and quantity of education and help or assistance that maybe other more affluent communities have. So for me, in order for us to get out and get for my parents to provide us a better education, they had to try to apply to a lottery to get me to a different high school that was not within my zone district, because the high school in my zone district was full of crime, not very good graduation rates. And it's unfortunate, right? Because these are kind of the communities and the people that you grew up with. So by them trying to pull whatever resources they can and learning from how to kind of get us somewhere else so that it is in a better neighborhood to get us that better education, it doesn't happen to everybody. And if people don't know about those options, they are pretty much kind of stuck where they are. So moving to Connecticut, New York City is very diverse, of course. As a professional, I immediately became aware of the lonely only syndrome and kind of feeling very isolated in an industry that is predominantly white male. And that's where, after a few years, I felt a need to connect. And again, there's that sense of community with people getting different perspectives and like-minded. And that's where we co-founded the Connecticut chapter for National Organization of Minority Architects, to provide resources for those and ideas and support to help also build up that pipeline, go to inner city schools, teach them about different career paths that otherwise would not be provided in that district because, again, of limited resources.
Thank you for sharing insights about the housing and discrimination, and also your personal experience, as well as the work you do. Tyron, please continue. And in your response, we'd appreciate if you'd also discuss the relationship between education and racial segregation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me this evening. And I would like to start off with one of my favorite quotes from James Baldwin. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced, right? So as mentioned, I'm Tyron. I'm from Connecticut. I was born and raised in Hartford, transitioned to East Hartford when I was about 10 years old. Graduated from Berkeley College. Got my degree in human resources, where I currently am the head of HR for the Wadsworth. And then for me, I bring two different perspectives tonight, where I come from the education lane and also from the human resources employment lane when we talk about racial segregation in Connecticut. So when we think about my experiences, I had a similar story where my parents wanted me particularly to go to a trade school. They felt like the trade was the way to go. And they wanted me to send me to a school where I can, because I love computers, and they felt like Cheney Tech, Howard Cheney Tech was a state school, and I would get the best experience, and I would get to meet a diverse group of classmates and teachers and learn from different kids from different communities throughout the state. That was quite the opposite of my experience here in Connecticut, going through a trade school. Going through a trade school, even in 2002, we suffered a lot when it came to, racial segregation, particularly in that particular school system. That was the first time I've ever been called a monkey. That was the first time I've been called a nigger. That was the first time where I had people say they did not want to sit next to us in the lunchroom because the students had no exposure to minority kids. They had no exposure to Black and brown kids in their communities. When you're thinking about Stores and Vernon and Tolland and Rockville, even Glastonbury, where kids came from, they did not interact with us well. So they did not know how to respond. And at that time, the state didn't even respond. I remember my senior year, we graduated with only 10 minority kids, but we started off with over 30, right? Because the kids kept leaving because they could no longer deal with the pressure. And even to the point where I share this story, often I share this story a lot, where our guidance counselor at the time came to us and handed us an application to a community college. And when we asked him, why did you give us an application to a community college? He said, well, this is your best option. Most of my friends, the 10 of us that graduated all went off to colleges and universities or armed forces, or started their own nonprofits, or doing really well, becoming CEOs and entrepreneurs in their own right. But just that mindset trickled down in our education system, even to today, right? And when we think about in 1996, when the Connecticut Supreme Court found that Hartford schools was racially, ethically isolated in a violation of our Constitution, they made a choice where they acted and responded, and accordingly, where they said, this is a problem, and we have to make sure every child in the state of Connecticut is educated equally, right? And when we think about the equally piece of it, is where we struggled over the years. We have something called the Ecs Formula. A lot of people ask me, Tyron, how is Connecticut funded? And I tell people all the time, Connecticut mainly is funded, some from federal, some from the state, but majority of it is funded by our property taxes, right? So when you're in an affluent community and you're willing to pay more in your property taxes, and you're willing to give more, have more businesses and more resources, that school district has a lot more resources. And where our surrounding communities of Hartford, or Manchester, or Waterbury, and Britain, and East Hartford, where we don't get that much funding, and we can't rely too heavily on our property taxes, are all set the adequate need that these school districts need to actually educate every child. I'm proud to say this current session, big shout outs to, Jason Rojas, Jeff Curry, Senator Anwar, Henry Jenga, where they really, in the state delegation, really tackled how we are going to fund Connecticut schools, particularly how we're going to rethink and recalculate that ECS formula, so that can kind of tackle some of the disparities that we found in our communities. But in closing, what I would say from that 1996 Sheff versus O'Neill, we have seen over 20,000 students, and I served on the CREC Council of magnet schools, where we have seen over 20,000 students get integrated from our surrounding communities, so our suburbs coming to Hartford, and surrounding Hartford school districts, and our Hartford school districts, what we call our Alliance districts, so the Hartfords, the Manchesters, and New Britons, or have the opportunity to go to suburban communities and get the education experience to continue to bridge that gap. Because once you get out of high school, you're going to be sitting next to someone, working with someone that is not going to look like you, that you've been accustomed to in high school and at college life. So I would say over the years, we have done a little better at making sure that we introduced our ECS formula, and we continue to allow that open choice concept to happen. We can have that inter-district traveling between our suburban towns and our urban communities.
Elysa, I know we're probably on time, but I wanted to quickly add something about education and kind of opportunities really quickly.
Please.
About, we talk about equality, right? But there's this thing about equity, and it's not the same thing. It's not about providing the same opportunities, right? That's one, but helping provide additional resources for those people who may not have that extra, like giving them an extra boost, right? So that you can then end up at the same equal position. And that was something that I'd hope to push in Connecticut in terms of some universities and introducing programs like I had, the Higher Education Opportunity Program, that if not were that, I would not be here today. And I did not get accepted into my university when I first applied because I did not hit that GPA mark, that minimum GPA mark that they're looking for. But that again is just a product of the environment and the area that I lived in, being low income and underprivileged. I don't have parents that graduated from college. They don't even have a high school education. But you have this other program that then accepts you because you are a minority, because you are low income based, and they provide these additional resources. They accept you, they provide counseling, they provide extra, training or tutors or any other resources to help that person bolster up so that they can reach that same level.
Yes, thank you. Yes, and thank you, Tyron, for sharing some of the hurtful things you heard as a young person from both your peers and adults in your life, authority figures, and just that encouraging information you're sharing about how due to Chef B. O'Neill, we're making some inroads. And that was also Omarys, telling your story. My daughter happens to work for a foundation called the Posse Foundation that aims to also provide people with those opportunities and support through school. And it is so important to just, to reach that equity level and to follow people to ensure their success. So Alex, turning to you, in addition to speaking from your experience and unique perspective, please share what motivated you to write the article you did on racial segregation, and please discuss what you learned and what surprised you during that process.
Yeah, well, so my personal story is a little different from Omarys and Tyron, which I think is exactly the point, exactly kind of what we're discussing here. I grew up in West Hartford, and I think back on it, and I think I thought of racism as this kind of distant thing or something, these kind of egregious acts. And that whole time I was never really stopping to think like, well, why is my neighborhood almost entirely white? Why is my town 75% white? It's not, these things I think for a lot of white people, like I was as a kid, I just didn't think about it. It was just like, okay, West Hartford is mostly white. Bloomfield is majority Black. Hartford is majority Black and Latino, etc. You just don't think about these things. And so then I went to college and I started learning about housing discrimination. And I remember vividly like going home to my parents and being like, oh my God, can you believe this? Like all of this discrimination over decades and decades and redlining. Did you know about that? And my dad was like, well, yeah, like, why do you think West Hartford is majority white and Bloomfield is majority Black? Like, this is the reason. And it was just kind of like a mind-blowing moment, like a transformative moment for me. And I've kind of kept that in my head or tried to throughout my work. And then last year, it sort of seemed like the perfect time to delve into these issues. And, sure enough, once you start researching, the reason that West Hartford is majority white is because in the 1920s, there were zoning laws that prohibited the building of multifamily housing. There were restrictive covenants that explicitly said no non-white people, in some cases, no Jews either, can live here. There were housing developments that explicitly or implicitly banned non-white people. Redlining codified these different things. And then when you get to Bloomfield, I'll do better. I'll show you. I've got some resources here that I'm going to share on my screen. Hope everybody can see. So first of all, we got these redlining maps. So this was in the 1930s, and this was the federal government created these maps to basically say which neighborhoods were safe to loan in for banks to loan in and which were not. So here we have the Hartford area, and I just want to spotlight a couple. So here, kind of the north end of Hartford, the city's oldest residential section, which has gradually drifted into slum area, now mainly occupied by Negroes. And so this, uncoincidentally, was coded red, basically telling banks, stay away from this neighborhood, more or less because Black people live there. Somewhat similarly, this town here, there's a typo, it should say Bloomfield, in the north end of Hartford and Bloomfield is largely given over to the Hebrew race. This is coded blue, not red, because I guess they viewed Jews as somewhat more palatable than Black people, but still kind of taboo in their own right. And then over here, we've got this map of basically lighter color means the population is all white. And then as you see the colors get darker, it means there are non-white people moving in. So 1920s, the area is essentially all white. And then due to the Great Migration, that begins to change. And you see that there begin to be some non-white people in Hartford. And around this time, West Hartford is passing all of these measures to prevent Black people from moving into the town. So as you can see, as we get into the 1960s, Windsor, Bloomfield, Hartford still are increasingly non-white, and West Hartford, because of all of those measures that I mentioned, not organically, these were decisions that town officials were making. For that reason, West Hartford was remaining entirely white. And what began to happen around this time is that the real estate market, a bunch of the largest real estate firms in the region basically decided that it would be profitable, and we can go into that if you want, to funnel non-white people into Hartford and also Bloomfield, and to keep Hartford, Avon, Simsbury, Farmington entirely white. And so what would happen, and there were studies, there were people who went undercover basically and proved that this was happening, was that if you were a white person and you said, hey, where in the Hartford area should I look for a home? They would say, how about West Hartford? How about Avon? How about Simsbury? If you were a Black person and you asked the same real estate agent, where should I look for a home? What do you think they said? They said, how about Bloomfield? So then what ends up happening as we go into 1980, 1990, and into today, eventually West Hartford, particularly sort of that one corner, the Elmwood neighborhood, begins to be less white, but you can see that there's a pretty stark line there where Bloomfield is, increasingly Black and Latino, and Hartford still is, and Windsor, East Hartford, Manchester, New Britain, and West Hartford isn't. And basically, I guess what I learned and what hopefully people took away from the piece that I wrote is that none of this was an accident. For all of us like me growing up who thought that, God said West Hartford shall be white and Bloomfield shall be Black. That's not how it works. Somebody had to basically decide, a lot of somebody's, both public officials and also private industry had to decide that this was kind of how it was going to be. And as Omarys and Tyron have talked about, that has really dramatic downstream consequences when it comes to the schools, when it comes to the programming and the resources, and eventually the outcomes people have. When it comes to wealth building, homes are the largest asset for most middle-class Americans. And so if you own a home, especially during the 20th century when homes were appreciating, if you were part of the kind of Great Deal push, I'm getting maybe too in the weeds here, but if you were part of the Great Deal push in the 1930s and 40s to buy homes in the suburbs, that asset really appreciated. And for a lot of us, like including myself, those homes were how our families built wealth that were then able to send us to the best colleges and live in the best neighborhoods and have the best resources. The people who in that time, due to those redlined maps and all these other factors, who were unable to attain those homes, were unable to build wealth. And that goes a long way, not the entire way, but it goes a long way to explaining why we have really, really egregious wealth gaps. Last thing I'll say is that people talk often about racial income inequality, but wealth inequality is far larger, far more stark. I've seen studies that say that for every $1 that a Black family has in wealth, a white family has $100. And that is largely because of this history that we just talked about how white people were able to access wealth in a way that Black people weren't. And I hope that the takeaway that people have is that this didn't just happen somewhere else. It didn't just happen in the South. It didn't just happen in larger cities. It happened really like right here in our neighborhoods and our towns. And it continues to stay with us today.
Thank you for sharing all this specific information you've learned through your research and your writing. And it's very stark, and when you look at it, and very appreciated, that to see it like we did. So I'm gonna go to our next question. I want to ask you each to speak. I'm sorry, I'm skipping a question. Our next question relates to many members of our community joining us in reading The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson, a book about the Great Migration. The question is, how is racial segregation in Connecticut impacted by the Great Migration? Tyron, if you want to please start us off, and then we'll move on to Alex and followed by Omarys.
Yes, so I think that is actually, at first I didn't even know about the book until I was asked to join the panel, and had an opportunity over a few weeks over 4th of July weekend to read the book. And I do love the saying where Isabel speaks to, where she says, they live in big cities, too distracted to care what the colored people did, as long as they did it to themselves. And that was the greatest blessing of all, right? So when you think about the Great Migration, and what she's saying in that statement is, we don't care what the colored folks do over there, as long as they don't come to West Hartford, they don't come to Avon, they don't come to Glastonbury, they don't come to South Windsor, right? And that same concept applies to when you think about Connecticut as a 169 towns, which is largely separated by race and by wealth, right? And there's some progress that Connecticut has been making to mitigate this migration into these communities. So when you think about our school system, right? You think about open choice, you think about charter schools, you think about magnet schools, where the goal is, right? We know that families are deciding to migrate to more communities where they don't want to integrate with people of color. And now we're allowing, with the open choice program and with our magnet schools and our charter schools, to allow that integration to co-mingle together, to encourage families to say, hey, family in this affluent community of Avon, think about sending your kid or your children to a school in Hartford, or a school in New Britain, or a school in Enfield, or a school in Manchester, so we can start to bridge that gap when it comes to racial disparities in our communities. Particularly, I think about the migration, the ECS formula, right? Because we know for a fact that people decide to buy homes based off of the school systems. So when you think about the ECS formula, where we're saying, okay, let's try to tackle that. How do we do that? We tackle that by saying, all right, these urban communities, let's give them a little bit more assistance based off of our calculations, based off of the need, based off of we know they need to be competitive and equal in our suburban communities. Now they will start to get the resources that they need. And then the hopes is, right, that maybe a community, a young couple, or someone who's wealthy, or someone who's just got out of college, let me think about moving to Manchester versus a South Windsor. Let me think about moving, to a Wethersfield or to a Bloomfield versus an Avon or Farmington or a New Canaan, right? So that's the ultimate goal when I think about that great migration here in Connecticut, is how so many people decided to migrate to certain communities so they do not have to interact with one another. But particularly what she says, and I experience it and we see it, we don't care what they do as long as they do it in their communities. So we're going to migrate to our communities and make sure that our community flourish. And whatever happens over there, whatever happens in Hartford, let it happen in Hartford. It's not going to trickle on over to our communities. So when I think about that question, that's what comes to mind.
Thank you. Alex.
Yeah. So I read The Warmth of Other Suns a year or two ago, and I think a lot of the housing discrimination stuff, it's almost like a sequel in a sense, because The Warmth of Other Suns does a really good job, incredible job of conveying the conditions that drove those characters, those real people, but characters in the book, to move from the South to the North. And then it does touch a little bit on, but I think sort of the history we're talking about is like the sequel to that, in that what happened when they got to the North. Certainly, I think in my experience of being around Northern white people, a lot of people like to think of, like I said before, racism as something distant. I know a lot of people who really sneer at the South for the racism that happens there, and don't think about the ways that racism often happens here in its own way. And so after those people ran away from the South to escape lynching or whatever, the other dynamics that they faced, they came to northern cities where they were able to live was restricted, where they were able to attend school was restricted. The racist abuse did not really disappear. It just took new forms. In some ways, maybe it became a little more subtle. So I think this conversation works very well in relation to that book, because it's kind of important to think about, like we said, what happened after they came to cities like Hartford.
Thank you. Omarys.
So for me, I just also learned about the book when I was asked to join this panel, and haven't yet read it, but it's definitely on my list because it reminds me a lot of The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, which is also very similar. And we read that recently as well as part of our office equity, diversity, and inclusion group. Again, it's we all have different perspective and experiences, right? And I've had my experiences, Tyron, you've had your experiences, Alex, you've had yours. And it's kind of like, that's the beauty of kind of that diversity and that inclusion, is really sharing all of these different perspectives and history. And for me, the Great Migration, obviously to escape all the discrimination that, African Americans faced in the South, of course, employment was another thing. So a lot of people came up here to big cities like Hartford, Waterbury as well, looking for employment, Chicago, New York, Cleveland, all these kind of big cities where, employment, was booming, especially around World War II, where a lot of, whites and Americans had to go and fight overseas. And they wind up getting, cheaper labor from African Americans. So work, housing opportunities, and escaping disparities and discrimination was kind of the main reasons they had this kind of Great Migration, right? But then they come here, and what happens? They're kind of stuck in these really high density, probably public housing situations. And that's something that The Color of Law really touched on, where people are brought in to these bigger cities for work and employment, right? They build these buildings and these towers because there's not enough single family housing to support this big rush of people. So they build these temporary housings for all these workers. And then they build these houses, but they only sell them and they limit them, and they're restricted to only white folk. Then whoever is left behind, that's how slums are eventually created. Whoever is kind of left in these public housing buildings, and that's where they get their stigma, right? They were never intended to be housing for, low income, disadvantaged, and minority folk. They were originally built to help support employment and the workforce, these big rush of people, while they then build these single family homes. But then when you are cut off from these opportunities and these choices, then where do you go? Where are your choices? Where are your opportunities? And then when you do have areas like Bloomfield, like Alex, you mentioned, and they're gearing them towards these areas, and then you have these issues of blockbusting, where they would sell to African Americans who were desperate, minorities who were desperate to really have that American dream, right? To buy that house. But then they sell them for prices that are outlandish. They can't afford the mortgage. they have to find other means to support themselves financially. So they wind up renting rooms or other means to really try to help make that mortgage and make that income. And then it just propels and it just snowballs. And then that's how things start to deteriorate, right? Neighborhoods start to fall apart because it's hard to maintain a home with a mortgage that is insanely expensive. So for my parents, and it's not the Great Migration, obviously we're talking 2000, but similarly, we're talking immigrant parents with no education, with no career, no pension, no 401k, and they moved to Waterbury. Why? Because Waterbury has a substantial amount of multifamily housing. That is the way for families who otherwise have no other education or financial background or means to buy a single family home. That is their way to sustain themselves. They bought a 2-family house, and that is how they were able to get out of the projects of public housing. We're not even talking affordable housing. We are talking public housing, not even Section 8, and it's really difficult to really climb and claw your way out of it. And that's where you have these zoning regulations and these redlining districts where you are not allowing, thank God for the Segregate Connecticut, passing this new law. And while it's small, it's allowing that opportunity for families to make affordable dwelling units, at least, right? To help sustain persons that don't have the means to buy a single family home. And if there are more opportunities for 2-family or 3-family housing, to again give those families the opportunity to be in those neighborhoods that offer better education and better opportunities for their children so that they can continue to progress. I think that's where I think this whole story and this whole panel is extremely important to listen and learn about.
Yes, thank you. And we're going to open it up for questions in a couple minutes. I just want to, in this time, you mentioned the color of law, Omarys, and is there, as individuals who are interested in desegregation in our state, are there resources that any of you can suggest for reading, organizations that are working in this area that people joining us this evening can follow up with? Do you, Tyron, do you have any resources you could recommend?
I know GIA is another good resource here in Hartford. The YWCA is really tackling on, we talk about affordable housing, we talk about redlining in our state. They're really taking a different, unique perspective on how they do that. So those are 2 organizations that I can think of.
Thank you.
I can weigh in
Alex.
with reading recommendations. I definitely second The Color of Law as a really awesome and really accessible book about this stuff. If you get through that and want more and want kind of like a deeper or like more in the weeds look, there's a book called Race for Profit by Keeanga Yamada Taylor, who's a Princeton professor. Really good, a little tougher to get through, but really good. Yeah, I mean, you guys know about Warmth of Other Suns. The famous Atlantic piece, The Case for Reparations, beyond the case for reparations, it also is just like a really powerful story about housing discrimination and how it affects specific people. I'm looking over at my bookshelf trying to see if I'm forgetting anything, but I don't know, that should keep you busy for a while, I would think.
Yes, thank you. Do you want to add anything to that, Omarys, before we turn over to taking some questions?
Sure. Yeah, to chime on Alex, it's learning is kind of the first step, really. You don't know what you don't know. I always kind of say that often. And like Alex, you said, you just didn't know. West Hartford was just the way it was, right? So you don't really know what you don't know. And I think learning is kind of the first key and the first step, and kind of reading and researching. I think, other than that, as it's speaking up. I mean, that's other ways of people to really get involved, is get involved with city plan, with zoning, with your community, when there are projects that are proposed, speak up in support of that, because it doesn't deter your community, it actually enriches it, because it provides a variety of, again, perspectives and again, like Tyron said, just exposure, right, to different people that then can also provide you that kind of their culture and their history, which again enriches people. And then joining maybe organizations like NOMA, Connecticut, or supporting it. I mean, we're more about architects, but we're also, looking to educate children in engineering and construction management, children of color, again, showing them that there's opportunities out there. There's Desegregate Connecticut, that, you can be there, learn, or be a part of it, and talk to legislators about some change. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things, but I don't know if this is a good time to talk about also kind of what you can do as a community as well, and getting together and forming groups to learn about projects that might be in your area that you can support, connecting with your local officials like your mayor. I've heard stories like in Hamden, my friend created a community group, and they've been doing a bunch of great things, inviting activists to speak and again, learn about these different issues, but partnering with, oh my dear, to make the housings, oh, I even forgot their name. This is so awful. But connecting with the mayors to find out kind of housing opportunities for organizations like Habitat for Humanity, that are looking for properties that's, free or, really affordable, so that they can convert them to give affordable housing to those people who are underrepresented and unfortunate.
Real quick.
Thank you. Those are great resources. Alex, you know what? I'm going to hold that thought. I just want to start us off on some questions, and we can always put information in the chat for people joining us this evening, that Alana can share. So the first question we have comes from Gail. Connecticut's Project Concern was one of the first voluntary school desegregation programs in the United States, where Hartford students were bused to suburban communities to attend school. What are your thoughts on whether this program was successful, and why or why not? And what alternatives would you propose?
So I guess I'll tackle that one. So we think about Project Concern is now called Open Choice. Now, I do think so what I would say is I think that when you think about students, you think about exposure, and you think about access, I do think the program was designed in a way where, yes, minority students from Hartford and underprivileged communities had an opportunity to go to suburban towns and provide, and one would say, a better educational opportunity. But what, for me, I think that yes. So the question is, yes, do I think that was a success? I think it was a success at the time. However, where I struggle with as a Board of Education member, as a community enthusiast, is that we don't see our affluent communities sending their kids to the urban schools, right? We don't see the kids coming to Hartford. We don't see the kids going to Waterbury, going to New Britain, going to Enfield, going to Manchester. But we're sending all of our kids out for that exposure. But we're not sending the suburban kids into the community where it was supposed to flow both ways. Now, some may say that with the magnet schools, yes, we have the magnet schools in Hartford and Enfield and Avon and different communities to try to encourage families and those communities to go to those schools. But I have not seen, based off my years being heavily involved in our public education system, I've not seen that same return from the suburban communities coming into the urban communities to have their child educated by those teachers.
Omarys or Alex, do you want to comment on that question? If not, I'll move on to the next one. Okay, thank you, Tyron. Question 2, In Alex's article, he cited that many suburban residents are against multifamily housing since they are concerned it will, quote unquote, destroy their neighborhood. What would the panelists say to residents who voice this concern?
I'd be interested in hearing what Omarys or Tyron would say about that.
Sure. I feel like that question is probably more targeted towards me a little bit. So I think, so I know that there's a lot of uncertainties, right? And anxiety, I guess, that comes from something like that. But I think where the fear, I guess, or the discomfort comes from is this idea that it's going to be maybe inundated and flooded with a lot of people. But I think that what people forget to think about with affordable housing, it's exactly what it is that we are looking to do for the state, right? And for the country. It's an integration and it's a mix and it's an inclusionary type of housing where you're trying to, again, it's equitable, right? You're trying to find and provide these types of opportunities to families that are disadvantaged, but also, it could be younger people, college students, it could be, young couples, as a startup kind of having an apartment versus kind of jumping in to find a house. We're talking about just providing these types of equal opportunities. And again, variety of spaces and building types to a neighborhood that, again, variety is kind of what provides that kind of interest and that sense of community. We're not talking high-rise towers, right? We're talking something that's scalable, something that works within your community. And as architects, that's what we do. We look at the neighborhood, we look at the community, and we make sure that these projects are scalable to that neighborhood so that it doesn't disrupt the aesthetics or the flow of that community. Scaling it to the right size and providing variety of spaces. And something that I see often when we're designing projects for developers, they have, of course, there's kind of federal and state stipends for providing affordable housing, right? Or housing units within, say, a multifamily complex, right? There's like a 10% requirement. And often we see only that 10% being met. And that's also the challenge because, the poverty levels are way higher than the amount of units and housing opportunities that we have in the state. And then the other thing that kind of, as a designer, gets me is that these units are put in the worst corners of these buildings. They're in the areas that have the no view. You're staring into another brick wall, and we have to kind of see and think of affordable housing similarly to how we look at accessibility standards, right? You have to provide at least, a portion of your houses or apartments to be accessible to those who are disabled. And within those regulations, we have to provide a variety of different views and a variety of quality type spaces so that, again, it's equitable. We're all getting kind of similar spaces. And, multifamily housing, again, not to kind of keep going on and on about this because I can as an architect, and looking at these things with zoning regulations, but it enriches and helps a community even economically because now you're also bringing in kind of additional income, for your shopping areas. And it really is a sustainable way to maintain a community and to, again, maybe bring up property taxes and bring up kind of the equity within the town. So I think that there's a lot of things really built into that. And I know there's a lot, we're kind of fearful of things that are new or fearful of change, but change is good. And I think that also it's all about that right balance, right?
I would just add one thing,
Please.
Which is that as a white person, it makes me uncomfortable to think that like my happiness or my wealth or possessions are at the expense of somebody else. So if I live in my dream neighborhood and it's beautiful and the houses are large and there are trees lining the street, but that's only able to exist because a couple miles down the road, somebody is living in poverty in an apartment that is overpriced or that isn't big enough, in a tightly packed area, and they're being sent to subpar schools. And these things are connected. Like the white person in the beautiful neighborhood is able to be there in part because that neighborhood is closed off to other people. So that, for me personally, makes me uncomfortable to think that like my happiness might be at the expense of some fellow human beings who live not very far away.
And I would just add,
Tyron.
thank you, Alex, for moving to East Hartford.
It's great here. I love it.
Elysa, can I say something? It's Gail.
No, we're gonna address some other questions. Thank you, though. So the
I
next
have a reply.
question is from Bruce. Evanston, Illinois recently established a reparations program to compensate those who lived in the community when housing or other specific discriminatory practices were causing such damage for Black and Brown families. Do the panelists see Connecticut towns doing something similar along those same lines?
So that particular community, what they're saying is that the community or the state is looking at that reparation as a whole to, I guess, give a rebate of some type of financial to colored people, correct?
Yeah, what they did was, real quick, they used the money, Illinois, I know a little about this because I went to college in Evanston. Illinois legalized marijuana and put aside a certain amount of marijuana income to give to each town. And they basically used that money to establish a program that would basically make housing more accessible for people who had lived in Evanston at a time when it was discriminated against, which, I don't know. It's definitely an interesting concept.
I think hearing about this now, I guess my initial take is, obviously the idea is commendable, right? And it's great. But say I lived in the town at that time and I'm receiving these reparations. Okay, great. Can I still go buy a house in West Hartford, right? So what can we do? So find that's kind of a great first step. And I'm not trying to kind of downplay it in any way. I think it's a great step, and anything is good, right? Progress is good in these small increments, but I think how can we do better? And I think first, sure that resource is provided, but where are the barriers? The barriers are what first need to come down so that then the doors are open for those types of opportunities to then be really taken advantage of.
The only thing I would say, bring it on. Why not? Why not?
Oops, sorry, I was muted there. Okay, our next question is from Susan. Do you think the latest statewide zoning law will be more successful at integrating the state than the previous iteration?
My understanding of that law, Omarys probably knows much more about this than I do, is that it was watered down pretty substantially over the course of it being passed, to the point where most of the measures are actually optional or opt-in or opt-out maybe, but same effect on the part of the towns. Which would make you think that maybe it won't have that dramatic of an effect, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, so I can speak a little bit to it. Again, it is like you said, it was a large bill. It was a long time coming, and some of the pieces had been taken out, some of the bigger kind of steps, right? The bigger changes. So while we didn't get, and I say we just because as part of NOMA CT, we supported Desegregate Connecticut, in their efforts of getting these things passed. But while the best effort, obviously the biggest effort we were trying to do and they were trying to achieve is trying to really, as of right, legalize multifamily housing in some communities that otherwise, or towns that otherwise would not have allowed them. There's still a win because it is a small step forward, but at least there's making some changes to legalizing kind of the affordable dwelling units, right? Making those as of right for a lot of homes. And yeah, while there is kind of an opt-out option for a lot of these towns, it is a few hoops that they have to jump. You know, it's not just an easy, okay, we don't have to do this, it's optional. They do have to kind of get the vote processes and kind of go through certain measures and certain steps to be able to, in a way, I guess, justify why they're opting out for those reasons. And there's also this kind of makeup of trying to, again, bring more perspective and diversity within the zoning panels, the zoning boards too, so that way at least everyone has a voice as well. So that will help to hopefully push things forward. And again, these are kind of small incremental changes, you know, to turn a ship, you got to go, right? Small degrees.
I think we have time for one more question. This is from Michael. Tyron mentioned that suburban families are not sending their children to more urban schools. How successful have magnet schools been to try and bring about greater integration between the suburbs and the cities?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you for that, Michael. So I currently sit on the CREC board, which CREC kind of oversees the magnet school and the lottery here in Connecticut from the Sheff versus O'Neill lawsuit. So yes, I think that when we think about the schools, when you think about classical magnet, you think about the theme-based schools, we have seen some suburban communities send their kids to schools that may be designed for performing arts, may be designed for a particular theme. But when it's just a traditional high school, traditional middle school setting, I've seen, based off of the numbers, when we think about the sending towns have to cover a portion of that tuition. A lot of it is from our alliance districts, right? So there's a lot of Hartford students going to the magnet schools, a lot of East Hartford students, Manchester, Britain, Bloomfield. These communities are sending their kids to that school. But we see a small number of affluent communities sending their schools to those non-traditional theme-based schools. But it is a step, right? I think that overall, over 20,000 students, that's a decent number when you think about the state as a whole. But I would say, what the lawsuit, what we have seen over the years, and there is some integration, but those seats, those students, when you walk those halls, you go to those graduations, you go to those performances, you speak to the community, a lot of those students in those seats are the kids of color, not seeing that same representation from the suburban communities.
Thank you. So unfortunately, we've reached the time to end our program. On behalf of the Jewish Federation of Greater Hartford's Jewish Leadership Academy and the Jewish Community Relations Council, I want to thank our knowledgeable panelists, Tyron Harris, Alex Putterman, and Omarys Vasquez. The information you shared this evening was so meaty and valuable, and you provided information about resources where we can find out more. I want to thank everyone who joined us for tonight's conversation and submitted your questions. It showed that everyone was really engaged tonight. We hope our community conversations on racial inequity programming, along with our community book read, provide a safe space for your own journeys to learn about and reflect on the impact of systemic racism. And we hope the conversations and learning can continue. During our conversation this evening, I was reminded of the 3 questions posed by Rabbi Hillel. If I am not for myself, who is for me? And if I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? Thank you so much to Alana Butler, Jody Angel, Heather Fiedler, Laura Zimmerman, David Warren, and all the members of the Federation staff for everything you do. We are grateful to Liberty Bank's corporate sponsorship of our community conversations programs, and the Jewish Community Foundation and organizational and individual supporters of the Jewish Leadership Academy listed on the slide that you see. Please plan to join us for our next community conversation on Tuesday, August 3rd, which will feature a panel of local experts who will share their personal stories and studies of the Great Migration to Connecticut. This discussion will also serve as the culmination of the community-wide read of The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. Additionally, please remember to fill out the survey posted in the chat to help the community continue to deliver relevant and meaningful programming. I wish everyone a wonderful evening. Take care.